Good afternoon, and welcome back to this third session, Spain at War. Following Professor Kagan's lecture, we will hear now along the same lines the Spanish General Military Offensive, 1779-1783, and its contribution to American independence. Prejudices and Reasons for a Secular Historiographical Omission by Hugo O'Donnell y Duque de Estrada, the Duke of Tetuán. The Duke is a lawyer and Marine Corps commander, retired, full member of the Royal Academy of History and corresponding member of the Civilian Academy of Letters, the Royal Academy of Córdoba, and the Academies of History of 16 other countries. Academician of Merit of the Royal Academy of Heraldry and Genealogy of Madrid, an elected member of the Royal Historical Society of the United Kingdom, honorary academician of the Royal Academies of the Sea and of Military Sciences and Arts, honorary professor at the Center for National Defense Studies. Unfortunately, the Duke could not travel to Washington, D.C. He pre-recorded his lecture at the Fundación Ramón Areces auditorium in Madrid. Let's now listen to the Duke of Tetuán's presentation.
Señoras, señores, buenas tardes o buenos días, según sea el momento en que ustedes conecten con esta grabación.
The Spanish General Military Offensive, 1779 to 1783, and its contribution to American independence. Prejudices and Reasons for a Secular Historiographical Omission. We know today, although it should always have been suspected, that the Spanish military action, both direct and indirect, in addition to financial support and the supply of arms, ammunition, and other military material, proved decisive for the final triumph of the revolution of the 13 colonies. Knowledge of these contributions is something that many official and private institutions have worked diligently to disseminate. These include two of the sponsors of this symposium, the Queen Sofía Spanish Institute and the Ramón Areces Foundation, together with Spain's Royal Academy of History, an institution established in 1735, 40 years prior to the Revolutionary War, and one whose founding mission was to clarify the important truth of the events, to dispel fables introduced either by ignorance or malice, obscured antiquity, or buried by neglect. As for the nature of the Spanish contribution to the war, allow me to go back to 1776, the year marking Spain's first contact with the American revolutionaries. Spain's ruler then was King Charles III, 60 years old. He was elderly according to contemporary standards, yet still fully lucid and active, fully engaged in the exercise of power, while also enjoying the hunt and other sporting activities. Charles was also known as a capable ruler and tireless reformer, a reputation that had crossed the Atlantic. When, for example, the American envoy, John Jay, arrived in Madrid in late 1779, in the hope of obtaining his country's recognition as a sovereign nation, along with financial support, he specifically alluded to the monarch's reputation for honor and integrity, and had encouraged the people of the United States to place their trust in his friendly disposition and support for their cause. Charles III's reputation as an honest, educated, even enlightened monarch also has stood the test of time. Later writing as an exile in France, the Spanish-born historian Andrés Muriel did not hesitate to assert, "Among the kings of Spain, ancient or modern, none perhaps governed with greater wisdom than Charles III." And after comparing his reign to that of other Spanish rulers, Muriel added, "Charles III was more fortunate, having ruled in more enlightened times, having entrusted sovereign authority to wise ministers. One of these ministers was Geronimo Grimaldi, who, in 1777, had expressed his reluctance to provide aid for the North American colonies in their bid for independence rebels. In doing so, he commented that the rights of all sovereigns within their respective territories are too sacred, and the example of rebellion too dangerous for His Majesty to openly support it. Grimaldi's hesitancy to support the rebels also rested on what might be described as the principal ideological contagion. In this instance, his understanding that the example of the North American colonies might inspire a similar bid for independence among the inhabitants of Spain's American possessions. Grimaldi, moreover, was far from alone. Many other Spanish officials on both sides of the Atlantic held similar views. But others did not. Among the Grimaldi's successor as First Minister, José Moñino y Redondo, Count of Floridablanca, who also served Charles as Secretary of State. Another was the Count of Aranda, the king's ambassador to France, and who represented Charles III at the signing of the Peace of Paris in 1783. These two ministers did not always agree, notably over Gibraltar, the famous outpost at the mouth of the Mediterranean that Spain had been forced to cede to Great Britain at the start of the 18th century, but was determined to regain. Indeed, one of the principal reasons Spain had entered the war against George III in 1779 was to recover Gibraltar, along with Minorca, the Mediterranean island also under British control. Floridablanca's and Aranda's differences over Gibraltar came to head in the negotiations leading up to the Peace of Paris, a treaty that required Spain to surrender its claims to Gibraltar in exchange for the possession of East and West Florida. In his early 19th century history of French diplomacy, Gaëtan Flasson recounts that Floridablanca, after having initially rejected a British officer to hand over one of the Floridas as compensation, he agreed to sign the treaty when England offered both. Aranda, it seems, was furious. At a meeting in the House of Vergennes, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs reportedly stood leaning on the mantelpiece, elbows resting on it, hands covering his face, and after half an hour of reflection, declared, "There are moments when one must be willing to offer one's own head for the fatherland. I accept both Floridas in place of Gibraltar. Though it goes against my intentions, I will sign the peace." That peace, of course, did not include the return of Gibraltar, despite Charles III's obsession with the fortress, which he saw as a symbol of his own dignity and that of his kingdom. I mention Gibraltar because Spain's repeated but ultimately unsuccessful attempts is one aspect of the war that American historians of the conflict traditionally forgotten or ignored. In many respects, however, that siege was the single greatest, longest lasting, and most costly battle of the war. In fact, one might even venture to call it the single greatest military episode of the 18th century. Without going into details, suffice to say that the fortress nearly fell to Spanish forces on a couple of occasions. These attacks also required the English to divert substantial military resources to defense. In practice, diverting ships the English could have used against the American rebels. The defense of Gibraltar also required a garrison of 5 elite English regiments and 3 Hanoverian ones. 500 or so specialized artillerymen, and about 100 engineers. A force just under 8,000 men, all of whom were stationed in Gibraltar until the peace was signed in September 1783. All of whom were stationed in Gibraltar until the peace was signed in September 1783, and Spain's siege finally lifted, even though new artillery assault and preparations for a new blockade were well underway. Speculation, of course, is always risky, but were it not for Spain's determination to recover Gibraltar, it is likely that Britain would have been able to move these battle-hardened troops along with more of its fleet to the American theater, alter the outcome of the war, and in doing so, either postpone, perhaps even forestall, its willingness to recognize the colony's independence. Speculation aside, American scholarship has traditionally failed to recognize during the course of the war and not pay attention to Spain's rationale for having entered into the conflict, along with its readiness to support the colonists' cause. Aranda, much like Grimaldi before, had numerous reservations about doing so, and although it may be apocryphal, a memorandum long attributed to him reads, "This federative republic, tomorrow it will be a giant, as it consolidates its constitution, and then an irresistible colossus in those regions. In such a state, it will forget the benefits it has received, and will think only of its own aggrandizement." Florida Blanca too harbored suspicions of American expansionism, but this did not prevent him from recommending that Charles offer the Americans both financial and material support, or what Aranda termed gifts. Scholars have detailed the amount of these gifts, but as a memo Aranda sent Florida Blanca, written during the summer of 1782, readily suggests, "I will not detail for your excellency the aid we have given over these 4 or 5 years, but I will state plainly that it has been substantial. In just the last year, they were supplied with 3 million reales. In addition to money, the gifts included weapons, supplies, and even uniforms, a much more useful contribution than it might seem, as the 4,000 uniforms, enough for 8 or 10 regiments, were delivered to Boston by 2 Spanish ships. Such gifts also underscored the legal status of the rebels' legitimate belligerence, with all its juridical consequences. From my perspective, in addition to the strategic importance of Gibraltar, American historiography has tended to ignore the overall value of Spain's gifts. They have also undervalued the strategic importance of the military victories engineered by Spanish Governor of Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, on the war's western and southern fronts. These include the aid provided to the American outpost, Fort Pitt, today's Pittsburgh. He did so by sending supply ships up the Mississippi and then Ohio rivers, escaping British surveillance along the way. Galvez's other achievements, his successful attacks on several British outposts in Louisiana, Manchac, Fort Charlotte, Baton Rouge, and Mobile. The organization of brigade sent to aid rebel forces in the northeast that left Louisiana on August 27, 1779. It comprised a contingent of veteran troops from the Louisiana Infantry Regiment, another from Havana, a militia company of free whites, blacks, and mulattoes, and 7 companies of American refugees that he recruited with the help of Oliver Pollock, Congress's agent in New Orleans, and other volunteers from several Native American tribes, including the Appaloosa, the Atacapa, and the Punta Cortada. Then, of course, was Galvez's all-important victory over the British forces, stationed at Pensacola in May 1782. Why, may I ask, have these and Galvez's other contributions been forgotten, and, some cases, even criticized as counterproductive? Allow me to cite Thomas Bach, a North American historian whose major work, Les Français en Amérique pendant la guerre de l'indépendance des États-Unis, 1777 to 1783, appeared in 1871. As its title suggests, Bach's main concern was to document French contributions to the war. In doing so, however, he became a spokesperson for the already existing denialist trend regarding Spanish aid, even surpassing it. Bach consequently ignores Galvez, except for a passing mention that not only minimizes the significance of Spain's war effort, but even suggests that Galvez's success at Pensacola was detrimental to the cause of the independence, inasmuch he allowed the surrendered English garrison to be released, with honors and arms, after promising, before the condition, that they would not serve against Spain or its allies until exchanged. The garrison was then shipped to New York, where Bach suggests they could have immediately been used against the Americans. Now, to be honest, Bach's take on this particular incident did not go unanswered. In his contribution to the 7th volume of Justin Windsor's sweeping narrative and critical history of the United States, published in 1886, Edward J. Lowell, a lawyer from Massachusetts, referred to this same incident in a footnote, suggesting that Galvez freed the British troops, but did so on sound juridical grounds, as he recognized that there was no formal alliance between the Spanish kingdom and the Federative Republic. Otherwise, Lowell had little to say, either about Galvez or Spanish contributions to the war. In the end, how best to explain the historiographical dismissal of both Galvez and Spain's overall contributions to the war? The answer, I suggest, can be found in the dictionary, specifically in the word prejudice, whose definition in the dictionary of the Royal Spanish Academy means a prior and tenacious opinion, generally unfavorable, about something that is poorly understood. All the elements of this academic definition can be observed when studying the process of a global confrontation in which Spain diversified its efforts and which has deserved, undeservedly rather, a severe judgment or a culpable ostracism from the main beneficiaries of the war.
Muchas gracias por su atención.
Okay. So we will now listen to Professor Larry Ferreiro, who will discuss the Franco-Spanish combined Royal Navies against the British Royal Navy. Professor Ferreiro is a naval architect and historian. He is the 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist for history for his book, Brothers at Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. His latest work, Churchill's American Arsenal, the partnership behind the innovations that won World War II, was published under Oxford University Press in 2022. Among his other works are Measure of the Earth, The Enlightenment Expedition That Reshaped Our World, Ships and Science, The Birth of Naval Architecture in the Scientific Revolution, 1600 to 1800, and The Bridging the Seas, The Rise of Naval Architecture in the Industrial Age. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ferreira.
Good afternoon. For those of you who are in the back, you may want to move in the front because there are some slides that will help to explain some of the story. It's a little hard. There we go. You notice that the title is the Spanish-French Royal Navies against the British Royal Navy. All navies were royal, not just the British. That's why the title is the way it is. This shows a Spanish ship of the line crossing the stern of a British ship of the line. For those of you who've seen the movie Master and Commander, you know why that maneuver was important. Ships were vulnerable at the stern. This is a Spanish ship of the line unleashing a complete carronade against a British warship. Happened quite frequently. This is the theater of operations, the world. The War of American Independence was a naval war. It was a global war. We are 250 years away from the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But that declaration was 250 years after the circumnavigation of the globe by Magellan and Elcano. During that period, Spain became the major trading nation on earth. Not Britain, it was Spain. And it was silver that fueled that trade. Silver, mined in Peru, mined in Mexico, was then sent to Asia, China specifically, for luxury goods, porcelain and silks and other commodities, which then made it their way back to Europe. Why silver? Because silver by that point was the basis of the trading system of China. The only thing it would accept was silver. Spain and its territories had the monopoly on silver. All of this trade, you can see, went from Europe through different choke points, different parts of the ocean, to Asia, and then recrossed. So, for example, the Spanish trade went from Spain through the Gulf of Mexico to Mexico City, which Gonzalo Quintero has pointed out was the largest city in the Spanish Empire, transshipped across the Pacific on the Pacific Galleon, traded for the porcelains and the enamels and the luxury goods back across the Mexican Isthmus back to Europe. All of this trade all across the globe had to pass through very narrow points. And sea power then and now was about choke points. Today, we hear about the South China Sea, Red Sea, Suez. Those are places where all trade has to go through. If you control the sea, you can't control the actual ocean. If you've been on the ocean, if you've been in the Atlantic, it's too big. But trade has to pass through very narrow points. Around the globe, Gibraltar was the most important one. By having bases and facilities, you were able to base naval ships that would allow you to control those choke points, which is why Gibraltar was so contested between Britain and Spain. There's choke points in the south of Tierra del Fuego, which is why they fought over the Falkland Islands, because that was a place that you could base ships to control that choke point. South Africa, choke point. Manila, choke point. But the most important one was the Gulf of Mexico. That's where the silver went through on the way to Asia, and luxury goods went through on the way back. And Spain had the home field advantage in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see on the right-hand side that Spain, by 1776, had bases and shipyards and apostaderos all around the Gulf of Mexico, in the Pacific, while France and Britain had just a small handful. So that was really the most important part of the most important theater of the entire war. I told you what the theater was. Let's set the stage. The stage was the 7 Years' War. You already heard about that. It resulted in Spain losing Florida, Spain losing Florida, France losing Canada, and the British Navy severely weakening the navies of both of those countries. That was the most long-lasting effect. Spain and France, who had already had an alliance called the Bourbon Family Compacts, realigned that alliance in a strategy called revanche, venganza. Those two words were actually used in the correspondence between the crowns, revenge. And revenge against Britain meant rebuilding their two navies, their combined navies, that, taken together, could defeat the British Navy. Why? Because Britain had an okay army. The army was good, but it wasn't great, but it had a first-class navy. So if you were fighting Britain, and it was the 18th century, it was always going to be a naval war. Britannia rules the waves, remember? So that war would have to be waged on the ocean against Britain's strongest point. I'm a naval architect, so we're going to get into naval architecture. That revenge strategy for the 7 Years' War was the common goal, but they did not have the same requirements. They did not want necessarily the same thing. Spain, most of all, wanted to regain territory. Gibraltar, Gibraltar, and Gibraltar, and then Minorca and Florida. And the reason why they wanted Florida, and let me go back 2 slides, is if you look at that choke point of the Caribbean, that's all Spanish territory except Florida, which is like a dagger pointed into the heart of Spanish trade. That is why it was so important to Spain. France did not want territory. They didn't want Canada. A few acres of snow is what one Voltaire called it. But they did want to regain their position as the center of power in Europe. Power in Europe was really where all negotiations were happening. Who controlled which alliances in Europe? So to get to Britain, they had to overwhelm the British Navy. So the plan was for the French and Spanish navies together to build enough ships, about 140 total ships of the line. Those are the big ships that fought against each other, which at the time would be able to overwhelm the 120 ships in Britain's fleet. In order to create a combined navy, one that could operate together, France, at the request of Spain, sent engineers and naval architects like Francois Gautier to be in charge of the Spanish shipbuilding, so that the shipbuilding was essentially in Spain the same as it was in France. Here's a little bit of naval architecture. The Spanish Navy by this time was building very strong, very sturdy, but fairly heavy ships, as you can see on the right-hand side cross-section. If you look carefully, those are very heavy futtocks. Those are the frames. That diagonal pillar in the middle creates great strength, but it makes the ships heavier. The French model was lighter, but it being lighter, they were also faster. And in order to ensure that a Spanish ship and a French ship could operate in the same line of battle, the two governments wanted their ships to be built along the same lines. So Gautier discarded the older Spanish system in favor of the French system and began building his hulls so they could operate that way. Gautier, in other words, in the Gen C speak, understood the assignment. He said, "My obligation is to see the Spanish and French vessels as forming a single armada." Now, at this time, all of you know by now that both France and Spain were supplying arms and covert munitions to the Americans, but by 1777, there was a series of defeats. It was obvious the United States needed a lot more. They needed a direct military alliance to fight toe-to-toe against Britain. Most importantly, they needed a navy. So, in 1778, France went ahead and allied with the Americans, knowing that Spain would follow. There was never a question in the mind of Vergennes that his counterpart, Florida Blanca, would eventually come along. This was always a joint operation. It was always planned that way. Spain could not enter into the fight until two fleets, one coming from what is today Uruguay, carrying troops, another coming from the Gulf of Mexico, carrying about $50 billion with a B dollars in silver, was able to make its way across the Atlantic. That convoy was under the command of Antonio de Ulloa, fascinating character. While those two convoys were at sea, they could not risk, they could not hazard entering into the war. Britain would immediately fall upon the convoys. Once those convoys were safely back in Spain, by the end of 1778, Spain could then take action to go to war against Britain, which they did under the Treaty of Aranjuez in April of 1779 that reaffirmed the Bourbon family compacts. Think NATO before NATO. Spain came in alongside France, unleashed lightning attacks on British interests. There was not, as you by now know, no direct alliance between Spain and the United States. Spain was fighting for its national interest. Its national interest did not necessarily include an alliance with the United States, but respecting France's alliance, Spain agreed they will not stop fighting until the British recognize the sovereignty of the United States. So, if not an alliance, certainly a partnership. And at this point, it's amazing how thirsty you get up here. Any military person will be able to tell you through experience that combined operations are the hardest operations to conduct. They need continuous practice with your partners. Think about D-Day and how many months were spent in joint training on the south coast of England, Slacton Sands, and so on. When the French and the Spanish decided they would fight together and invade Britain, there was none of that. Not really very much preparation. So they were going in more or less cold. That did not mean that the sailors who were commanding their vessels were inexperienced. Luis de Cordova, on the left-hand side, had risen through the ranks through many wars, battles, expeditions. He became Teniente General Vice Admiral in 1773. So when Spain entered the war in 1779, Cordova was 73 years old. He was appointed, along with his French counterpart, to lead the combined French-Spanish Armada on his flagship Santísima Trinidad, the largest sailing warship in the world ever built. 150 French and Spanish ships, which, by the way, was larger than the more celebrated 1588 Armada, sailed for Britain. One squadron was led by the aforementioned Antonio de Ulloa, the man on the right with his hand on the globe, also a great scientist. Despite all the difficulties of not having practiced together, what laid low the fleet was not planning, but disease, epidemic, probably dysentery, which swept across the Bourbon fleet, confined ships, thousands of sailors all together, and it turned these warships into hospital ships. 8,000 sailors were sick and dying, and the ships had to return home. It failed. It failed tactically, but it succeeded strategically in that the British now had to redeploy their entire fleets away from America to protect the homeland, to protect their colonies in the Caribbean and all across the world. In other words, it did exactly what it was supposed to do, spread the British Navy thinly around the globe. It also meant that Britain was no longer able to command the oceans. In 1780, Córdoba was elevated to the rank of Director General of the Armada. He and his chief strategist, a brilliant man who was not written about nearly as much as he should be, sort of on the plane of Mahan, was José de Maceredo. And he led, they led together actually, a combined Spanish-French fleet that, because of good intelligence, they knew was crossing the Atlantic at that point. And they knew approximately where they were going to be because the French-Spanish intelligence was very good. And so they were listening for the fleet, because the fleet, the convoy was, had cannonades that would go off every so often. And they heard them at a distance. Córdoba ordered his flagship, or one of the ships, sorry, to sail into the convoy, lit the stern lamps. The convoy, the British convoy, thought that was the lead ship of the British escort, followed the Spanish ship, and at dawn they realized they were in the middle of this Spanish-French combined fleet. The British escorts ran, and the French and the Spanish were able to capture 55 British ships, which showed that despite the early blunders, the Spanish-French were now able to operate or able to conduct combined operations. Most of the Spanish officers spoke French, so that wasn't too much of a problem. The convoy brought to Cadiz 55 ships, 3,000 prisoners, 80,000 muskets, 300 cannon, uniforms and materials for 40,000 troops. Yes, it was a blow to the British economy, worth today the equivalent of about $17 billion. Insurance rates went up in Britain, but Britain shrugged it off and kept fighting. But they had lost control of the Atlantic. Bernal de Galvez, you know his story. You know he was from the powerful Galvez family, governor of Louisiana, age 31 in 1777. 1779, the news of the Treaty of Aranjuez arrives. Galvez is ready. He gets his troops quickly deployed. In rapid succession, they take Baton Rouge, Natchez, Mobile, a couple of others. Then a series of hurricanes sweeps through the Caribbean, sweeps through the Gulf of Mexico, lays devastation to cities, ships, fleets. But Spain, if you remember, had that home field advantage in the Caribbean. It had ports, it had dockyards, especially Havana. They reconstituted their fleet, and in May of 1781, they were able to launch an invasion of the British capital of Pensacola. That was led by Galvez in his sloop Galveztown, which is where his slogan, Yo Solo, I Alone, comes from. But that 2-month siege was also supported by the man at the bottom left, José Solano y Bote, a French commanding officer, the Chevalier de Monte. So, yo solo, pero no solamente yo. I alone, but not just me. Galvez had no problem with his marketing campaign, but it really was a joint, combined operation because they learned how to do it. Victory in May 1781, the British are driven out of West Florida. At the time of the Battle of Pensacola, the French fleet under the Comte de Grasse in the middle was arriving in the Caribbean. In July, after the Battle of Pensacola, de Grasse meets with Francisco de Saavedra, who you've already heard about, and informs Saavedra that he has to go north to aid Washington and Rochambeau during that window of about September to November, which is hurricane season in the Caribbean. They can't operate anyway, so they're going to go north. De Grasse is going to leave a few of his ships to protect the French colonies in the Caribbean. Saavedra makes a deal and says, take all your ships. We'll protect your colonies, but when you're done up there, come back down here, and together we are going to invade the British stronghold in Jamaica. So De Grasse takes his entire fleet north, and as it happens, they fight the British fleet off the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes in September of 1781. And the only reason De Grasse was able to take his entire fleet was because the Spanish victory at Pensacola allowed the Spanish to protect their colonies. Pensacola and Yorktown are inextricably linked. And from this point forward, anytime you hear a mention of Yorktown, you should immediately think of Pensacola, and those two battles should be linked in textbooks and works and classrooms. They are two battles that have to be thought about together. You know the rest of the story. Cornwallis was trapped without any British support, surrendered in October of 1781, but the war was not yet over. Because by 1781, Britain was fighting 5 separate nation states: Spain, France, the United States, the Dutch Republic, and the Kingdom of Mysore in India, without an ally to its name. It was 5 against 1. Britain was overwhelmed. The fighting took place all over the world, from Canada to the Bahamas, Nicaragua, the Caribbean, South America, Cape Verde, Cape Town. We've already talked about Gibraltar as being the largest siege. That, on the bottom right-hand side, that's a mushroom cloud. That's how violent the conflict was. Nicaragua was where Horatio Nelson had his first encounter with the Spanish. He was laid low probably by a tropical disease, but it was a bad disease. He was shipped out within a few weeks of getting there, although later he lost an arm before Spanish troops. So he didn't have that much luck against the Spanish. The fighting went all the way around the world to India. The last battle of the War of American Independence was the Battle of Cuddalore in India in 1783. The War of American Independence was not won at Yorktown. It was won through maritime alliances. This is the War of American Independence by the numbers. Those of you in the back who have not moved forward can't see these, but the people here can. About 250,000 American troops fought. The numbers are not clear, but they were almost all soldiers. The French and Spanish troops combined were about 200,000 soldiers and sailors, many of them on ships at sea around the world. Britain had about 230,000, of which over half were Navy at sea. So I told you it was always going to be a naval war. And the rest were land troops, only a minority of which were actually in North America. So what happened? Well, it was in this crucial period of around 1781 that the combined Spanish and French fleets, 129 ships of the line, were greater than the British combined fleet of about 117 ships, and they were overwhelmed. For that brief but strategically critical period, the British were outnumbered, outgunned, outfought, and outclassed. So a question was raised earlier. Was Spain important to the victory of the United States? The answer is, claro que sí, of course. But it's a larger point. Without the war against Britain could not have been won without the combined forces of Spain and France and the United States all working together. It is alliances and partnerships, then as now, that are better than going it alone. The final point, was made by our friend Mazaredo, who said to the next king of Spain that a navy should be the most well-equipped machine of the monarchy. I think that's a message that we should resonate even today. Thank you. Okay, I'll leave this here.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question that I think is in most people's mind. So Gibraltar was Spanish territory at one time. When and why did Spain give it up to the British? When did it do so? Can you take us back a little bit in the history of Gibraltar?
It wasn't given up. It was forcibly taken. It was during the War of the Spanish Succession. All of you remember the War of the Spanish Succession, which was a very convoluted European war that pitted the Bourbon family against the Habsburg family, and there was a lot of territory at stake. Gibraltar was one of many pieces of territory that was being fought over. And I think the year was, I'm going to ask Gonzalo, was it 1704 that the British assaulted and took? So 1704, so well before the 7 Years' War, and they never did give it up. And there were multiple attempts to regain Gibraltar. And it's rather surprising, if you've been to Gibraltar, great territory. You look across the strait and you can see the other side of the Pillars of Hercules. It's a very narrow passage, maybe 9 or 10 miles, I think 9 or 10 miles, something really narrow. And you'd wonder, why couldn't Spain just surround Gibraltar and recapture it? And the answer is to keep blockade forces at sea for long periods of time is very difficult. So even in that narrow space, the British were able to get supplies through the Spanish blockade, very often at night or by small boat, and so they were continually able to resupply and rearm despite a concerted effort. Plus, coming close to the coast, it's not a very easy coast to assault. There's no flat beach territory to beach and bring soldiers. Cliffs come right up, so you're immediately under fire. If you've ever studied Gallipoli, you'd see a lot of similarities with that. So logistically, it was very difficult to pry out of the British hands. And I hope that that answers the question. But again, let me be clear, Gibraltar controlled that important choke point. It was rather fortunate in the Second World War that allowed the Allied armies to maintain control over much of the Mediterranean because they were able to control that traffic through the strait. U-boats, for example, had a hard time passing through the strait because British destroyers were based in Gibraltar. That's just a more recent example.
Another member of the audience would like to know why the emphasis on silver, and not on gold. Wasn't gold more valuable? Why would not China accept gold instead of silver? I guess.
I can talk about it in the supply side and in the demand side. So I'll start with the supply side. As most of you know, once Spain conquered the territories of Mexico down to Peru, they found silver mines within 50 years. But silver is and was far more abundant than gold. Gold was a short-term interest of the conquistadors, but gold, remember, was sacred. It wasn't used as money by the Inca or the surrounding tribes, and I'm pretty certain it wasn't used as money by anyone in the North, Aztecs, and so on. It was always a religious, it was always considered religious. But silver is far more abundant, and so extracting silver, which was a noxious, terrible, horrible process, was immediately much more profitable. Gold could only be used for a little bit, and then silver took over. Silver's easier to alloy. It's easier to make into money. Gold doesn't really alloy very well. It's very soft, makes for terrible currency. That's the supply side. So when you think of silver, think Peru and think Mexico. The demand side, China had paper money for quite some time, but I think it was under the, now I'm going to get my dynasties a little confused, so you're going to have to give me some leeway, but in the transition from one dynasty to the other, let me not mention them, the paper money had been revalued or debased for a long period of time until a point where China decided that silver was going to be the basis of its own monetary system. Now the good news was, Europe was trying to trade with China, but European silver mines couldn't really produce very much. And what did the Europeans have to offer China? We can give you wool. Well, thank you so much. It's hot here. Lead, pass. But when silver started to become extracted from north of Mexico City, from Potosi in what is today Bolivia, the production increased silver capacity in the empires by 10 times. And so when they used to use silver under Felipe II, the joke was silver is mined in Peru, goes to Spain to die, and is buried in Genoa because it was being used to finance war. After the silver was discovered in great quantities and trade opened up with China, silver was mined in Peru, went to Manila to die because that was the trading post, and was buried in China. So about a quarter of all the silver production in that period was going to luxury good trade and ended up in China. That was really where all of the, wait, does this sound familiar? So China was very much the place where the upper classes were going for their goods, and silver was the way they paid for it. Much as the American dollar is today the global currency, the reserve currency, silver was then. Much more information than you asked for.
And one last question. Do you think it still holds true that wars will still be won in the ocean?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that question?
Do you think it is true, what you said, that most wars will be won or were won in the ocean? Would that be true? Would that hold today?
The naval conflicts decide the circumstances of what happens on land. That was true then. It was true during the, more recently, the First and Second World Wars. It's been true today. They are decisive in that they set the stage for victory or defeat on land. Ultimately, because we are on land, we have our final decisions, as it were, in land battles. But I'm going to use the example of World War II because we're already on the 80th anniversary. It was Dwight D. Eisenhower, five-star general, who said that this war was going to be decided on the ships, amphibious and transport ships and supply ships that we can deploy to keep everybody on shore going, and to prevent the adversary forces from also being able to do that for them. So naval forces have always set the stage for what is almost always eventually a land campaign. I hope that is nuanced enough, but also clear enough to answer the question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Ferreiro.
You're most welcome. It's been an honor.
We are running a little early, so we will reconvene after our coffee break at 4:30 for the last session. 4:30. Thank you.